Good evening. My name is Kate Beans. I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation here in Waltham. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Mill Talk, an evening with the authors of Boston Made, From Revolution to Robotics, Innovations that Changed the World. Our Mill Talk series are sponsored by the Lowell Institute, and we're very grateful for their support. Our presenters this evening are Dr. Robert M. Krim. Bob is the founder and leader of the Boston History and Innovation Collaborative, for which he assembled a multi-university research team who worked with hundreds of organizations and businesses studying nearly 500 innovations that changed the world. He developed, with that research, he developed 4 Centuries of Innovation, a permanent exhibit at Boston's Logan International Airport. He has a BA from Harvard and earned a master's in U.S. history, a master's in economics, and a joint PhD MBA from Boston College. A professor at Framingham State University, Krim teaches innovation and Massachusetts history. Alan R. Earls is a Boston area writer who has covered high-tech innovation for more than 30 years. He's authored or edited more than a dozen books on innovation enterprises, such as Polaroid, Digital Equipment Corporation, and Raytheon, as well as regional histories such as Route 128 and the birth of the age of high-tech. He was guest curator for the museum's 2006 Widgets of Route 128 exhibit. He is also an occasional tinkerer and a licensed ham operator. Bob and Alan, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate, very much, and thank you, Charles River Museum, for having us here live in this age of COVID, talking about our book and what we found over time. This evening, we're going to tell and go through 6 stories of innovation that have happened in the greater Boston area out of those 400 or 500 that we found. And in doing that, we're also really trying to tell you about what we have found overall in these decades of work that we've done in terms of looking at Boston through the lens of innovation in a way that really other historians haven't in the past. And we feel we have some very important things to tell you. The question is, did you know that Boston has been one of the most innovative cities in the world for innovation, over its 4 centuries? We started this journey in the fall of 1997, and a long time ago now, in order to gather information for a bus tour of sites of Boston-originated innovations. And when we started, we knew probably about 20, 25, 27 innovations, and we started looking for more. Eventually, as Kate mentioned, we involved hundreds and hundreds of people and hundreds of organizations in this, what became a 2-decade-long quest at finding out what was this region and what was this city's innovation story. By 3.5 years out, by 2001, we had identified and researched in detail about 90 innovations. 2 years later, we had added another more than 200 innovations to that, both identifying them and researching them. And by 2005, we had 400 innovations that we had validated. We have hundreds more that we haven't gone into as much depth on, but we've gone a long way from the 27. What we found is that the sheer number and breadth of major innovations that changed the world, 400 plus, coming out of the greater Boston area, or one might say Massachusetts, is unmatched by other cities or other regions in the United States. We had run that bus tour that we originally said that we would bring into being, which highlighted about 15 innovations. And we had a live actor, and it was very interesting in itself. But as we got to these stages in 2003 and 2005 of the hundreds and hundreds of innovations we'd found, it really turned in our minds the question from just how many innovations were there to a different one, which was, why was Boston so innovative over time, especially compared to other cities and other regions, Silicon Valley, a newer one, or New York City, an older one. So really no one had ever noticed what we had found. I'm a Boston native, I certainly never knew about this, that Boston's sheer number of innovations was so great. People have studied the history of Boston a lot over time. This is not something that had been noticed. So what's the story? The story of why as well as the what that we found. We looked for people who had, and organizations which had looked at the history of innovation in different cities in the United States. And we found that most comparative studies looked at the history of innovation as starting during World War II. In other words, that it was about 70, 75 years old. That is particularly different than Boston's innovation story, because our history of innovation here goes for 4 centuries. It's not just the post-World War II period. And unlike Silicon Valley in that way. And the other measure that we have, people identify innovation a lot with our major universities. However, we had a number of world-changing innovations in our first century, from 1620 to 1720. So the story is really different than anybody had grasped in terms of what innovation is. So one thing that we needed to establish was the question of what we mean by an innovation. It means many different things, it turns out, even though it's such a simple word. So what we mean when when Alan Earls talks about innovation tonight is a invention that originated in the greater Boston area, an invention which changed the nation or the world. The innovation needs to be well known and well used. So at the end of our session, before the questions and answers tonight, we're going to return to what have been our 3 major conclusions. So another thing that we needed to identify was what constituted an innovation. For many people in the world, innovation is really synonymous with technology. And we really had felt all the way along that it certainly involved healthcare as a second area, and most people would include that. But it also included 3 more categories that do have innovations, and those innovations share a lot of the characteristics with technology and healthcare, meaning finance and education and social innovations. So really there are 5 silos, as I say, of innovations that we've investigated in looking at these 400 years. One of the people who has followed what we've done quite a bit is Scott Kersner, who's the Boston Globe's innovation columnist. And he has said, you know, Boston really punches above its weight. He's talking about innovation. We really consistently go much further than most other cities think we do, and most other Americans, really. What has driven Boston to punch above its weight? Well, we asked this question to many people in the Boston area after we had come to this point in 2005, where we're looking at what is it that really drives, what causes the innovation to be so important. And we found that there were 24 causes, and the phrase that we preferred to use after a while, what were the drivers rather than the causes was the better word we came up with, which led to so many innovations. And so we decided that we would study each of 50 innovations that we chose out of the 400 overall that we had validated. And why did those 50 innovations happen here? We made sure that the 50 innovations were ones that represented all the 4 centuries, as well as that represented the 5 different silos during those centuries. So after that, we're also looking at the innovations as a whole. The 50 innovations we studied in great detail. We had teams of historians, of economists, many graduate students, undergraduate interns, and others working with us. And we did what were essentially 50 histories of these different innovations. Here up on the screen are the 24 drivers, the 24 causes for innovation. That includes a number of different ones. For some people, their explanation of why this area has been so innovative is because Massachusetts was the first state to have public mass education, and that is the reason. For other people, it's that there's federal funding. This federal government has given money at various times, and that's the reason for the innovation. A third major cause or driver that people have talked about is that immigration has made a difference. Boston has had the second largest number of immigrants come to the United States of any port. Boston is after New York and ahead of LA. So immigration and the different waves of innovation, immigration have led to it. So other ones that we felt were important are really to look at entrepreneurship and to look at a few others that we'll highlight for you in just a minute. And here they are. There were 5 top drivers which rose to the top of each of the economic eras of Boston over 4 centuries. And out of the 24 drivers in the study of 50 innovations, the number 1 driver is dynamic entrepreneurs. We don't mean necessarily entrepreneurs in the narrow sense of somebody who's starting a business. It could be dynamic. The entrepreneurs might be people working in state government. It could be people who are social entrepreneurs along the way. But these entrepreneurs are ones who are willing to break through every barrier that's in front of them. They're not very passive about their entrepreneurship, is what we found. Second was that the entrepreneurs were not doing it alone. And each set of entrepreneurs for each of those 50 innovations had a vibrant network of people who they worked with and brought into what they were working on. So it was the entrepreneur not acting alone, but with many other people in the same field as well as some surrounding fields as well. Then third, The third area is that there was local funding for this new enterprise that was started. And that local funding came from various sources over the 400 years. In early years, it was wealthy Puritans, and later on, it's been venture capital. Fourth was that Boston had a number of people who were very interested in adopting for themselves, or buying, in the case of a product, the new thing that had been invented. In other cities, you don't always find that things that get invented get purchased. Boston, it did. So these four drivers are all local in nature. And we looked for a term that seemed to apply to all four of them. And they're working with a couple of different groups of people over time. We came up with this phrase, we called it the bump and connect. They're local, and they tend to reinforce each other. In fact, operating with the fifth of these drivers, which is the national global market demand, meaning that the product, once it was made, tended to get sold not just in New England, but in New York and Pennsylvania, and eventually nationally, and then from there globally. And so this bump and connect is really the secret sauce, as some of the people who are working with us called it, that this was something that the four or the five were sort of fused together. They operated as one. And this sort of analysis is really fairly different than what people have looked to in other regions in the United States or the world for what has driven innovation. But this is what we found by looking through those 50 different innovations. So we want to turn to really the stories of innovation, which we imagine you'll find as interesting, if not more interesting, than some of this analysis that we've laid out. And the first story of the six that we want to talk with you about in our session with you tonight is the story of Alexander Graham Bell. The sort of vanilla ice cream, if you want, of innovation in innovations that have happened in the greater Boston area. He invented the telephone. You know, everybody sees that as one of the major innovations of time. You know, the newer generation sees it more as the iPhone, I suppose. But the question that arose for us in studying this one was, why did he invent it in Boston? Mr. Bell was not a Bostonian, or at least not until he moved here when he was 26 or 27. He was raised in Edinburgh and educated at the university there, and did his early work in his early 20s, when many people are inventors, in Edinburgh. He moved from there to London, and in London he worked mainly in the field that his father had been in, which was education for the deaf. So the question was, he moved from London and then went eventually to Brantford in outside Toronto in Canada. And then eventually he came to Boston when he was about 24, 25. And so the question was, why Boston? What was he was floating around, as a lot of people in their 20s do. And so the first job he got is not one of those surprises. His father knew somebody who knew somebody at Boston University. This is an image of Boston University, which was then in downtown Boston, near the Boston Common in the 1870s. And Bell was hired to teach younger deaf people, mainly what we consider high school age these days. But that job was not a job that paid a tremendous amount, as still happens to students who have come out of college relatively recently. And Bell was also interested in something else. Boston and New York were considered in the early 1870s as the two best places to be if you're interested in taking the telegraph, which was the major technological innovation of the 1840s, and here we are by the time Bell got here in the 1870s, and there was a question of what was going to be the 2.0 version of the telegraph. What was going to be one that allowed the telegraph to send multiple messages at the same time? It was called the Harmonic Telegraph. There also was something else that Bell was interested in. Because of his work with the deaf, he was very, very interested in this question that really few were looking at the time, which was, could you produce the human voice moving from one telegraph area to another place geographically? Could you send the human voice over a telegraph wire? If you have the dit-dit-da-da of Morse code, named after Samuel F.B. Morse, who came from Boston but didn't invent the telegraph in Boston, these were some of the things that really were involving people, whether in New York or in Boston, in what would be the next phase. So Bell, while keeping his day job, really it lasted till the mid-afternoon, Bell went over and went to this company that was owned by Charles Williams, Jr., in this building, which is in the image here, which was at 109 Court Street, which is about where the John F. Kennedy Federal Building is, near Government Center T-Stop these days. And Bell went in, he talked with Charles Williams a great deal, Charles Williams Jr., who ran it, and he also talked with the people who were working for Williams at the time. One in particular was somebody who he talked with quite a bit, a guy named Thomas Watson, who, this is an image of him in 1874, when Bell was about 2 or 3 years older than Watson. And Watson was very good at designing models of technical sort of things. And so it was Bell's more theoretical sense of science and Watson's more practical sense which were brought together. Bell, going back to the slide of before, Bell had rented the top floor of the wooden garrets where those wooden windows are on the top floor of the Williams building. And there's an inside picture here of the garret. And Bell used that as his first lab, and he and Watson worked there. Well, they, along the way, needed more than just Watson's help. They needed a pattern diagrammer to help do the sort of diagrams that would be needed once Bell came up with these new inventions that he was hoping to make. He brought in Louis Latimer, who worked at a law firm doing patent work about 4 or 5 blocks away. Talk about the bump and connect of people. And Latimer was the son of runaway slaves who had stowed away in a ship and arrived in Chelsea, and he was brought up in Boston and had been in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. And we have here an image that you can see that of the pattern diagram that he drew for the first telephone. It was not called a telephone. You can see they have the word telegraphy on the patent thing. The telephone was not a word used yet. But it shows the work that is the sort of thing that Latimer did. Latimer and Bell talked quite a bit, and Latimer, after working here with Bell, went to New York City and worked with Thomas Edison, where he became Edison's chief engineer, and it was Latimer who took what was the electric light that Edison had designed, but that light, most of us don't know, only lasted for 3 or 4 minutes. And Latimer came up with the idea of a different metal for the filament, and that turned the electric light into something which would last for 8 hours. So Latimer deserves a lot of credit for the Edison electric light, which was done, of course, in New York City. So along the way, then Bell had been connecting various people into his network, and he had larger and larger bills with Latimer and with Watson and others that he was hiring, and he desperately needed money if he was going to keep on working on this telephone. And so he tried to turn to various people who his father knew in the city. His father had never lived in Boston, but had connections because he was world famous. And one of the people that was not in that circle, but was in Bell's more immediate circle, was the father of one of his students. This is Gardner Green Hubbard, and his daughter Mabel was a 16-year-old student at the time, and through Mabel, he met her father, and her father was interested in investing in the telegraphy that Bell was doing, and was a thing that really made it possible for Bell to stay in the game as he needed to be by that spring of 1876. There were others working on something like it in Chicago, and some of them had come to Boston looking for help themselves. Bell was being followed by the press at the time, who felt that he was on to something which might be one of the big new things. As we talked about before, Boston always had interest in that. Here he is. This is an illustration sketch that was done of Bell in April of '76. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's some acid that is spilled on the table that had come out of the beaker here. And that acid had spilled onto Bell's pants. Bell and Watson, at this point, were working in a different locale, not too far away, on Essex Place, as it was called. And they had the telegraph wire going from in between their two rooms, and there was a very thick wall in between. Anyhow, when the beaker fell and the acid dripped onto Bell's leg, Bell is supposed to have said something, "Watson, come here, I need you." And sooner than he thought came Watson bounding through the door. And Watson said, "I heard you on the phone." In other words, this was the moment that they hoped would exist, but nobody had ever heard it before. And so they fixed Bell up. He was in pain for a little while. And very soon they decided to do some public demonstrations in different parts of downtown Boston, as well as one with a telegraph wire going from the Williams Building in downtown Boston over to the Cambridge Athenaeum in what's now the area in Kendall Square. The press found out about this. Not only the local press, but the national press found out about this. And within a couple of weeks, Bell got an invitation from the place that a new inventor would want to be heard. And that was the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Declaration of Independence was coming up in Philadelphia in about 6 weeks, and Bell was a late addition but was added to make a presentation to the leading scientists in the United States who would be gathered there July 3rd, 4th, 5th. Among the people who were asked to see Bell at the time was the first head of the Smithsonian Institution, the leading scientific place in the United States, as well as the leading businessman in technology, new technology, which was the president of American Telegraph. And even the emperor was there from Brazil, and the three of them, plus about 10, 12 other people were gathered. They were separated by about 20 or 30 feet, sort of the other side of the room, not unlike the room that we're here in the museum here. And they could hear the conversation. My God, this was amazing that they could hear both ends of the conversation. And from that, Bell really had made it. The next day, the newspapers in the country talked about that this telephone thing was really the new thing. In fact, there's some question that day whether the president of American Telegraph was going to buy it from Bell that day. It didn't happen. And Bell was crestfallen, of course. He took the train back to Boston, but there was good news at the other end. He got out. He went over to Charles Williams's place where his first garret had been, and Williams had a question for him. Williams said, I want to buy the first telephone. I want to have one. Well, of course, you couldn't buy one. You need to have two, but it wouldn't really work with one. And in any case, Williams decided to buy telephone 1 with number 1 on it, and telephone 2, which had number 2 on it. And they were connecting Charles's office on the first floor of 109 Court Street with his home where his wife lived on Winter Hill in Somerville. And so there was a specific telegraph wire that went 4 miles to connect it. In any case, out of that, there was the decision very quickly to buy to have Williams buy the first telephone. And Hubbard, his main finance, said, let's just form a company. And they named it Bell Telephone that day. Later, it would be named AT&T. And they started producing phones, first at the telegraph place that Williams had, and then around Boston, several places, some places a little bit closer to where MIT was, which was about 7 or 8 years old at the time. So out of that, there was local production of phones, and very soon phones were being sold around New England and then New York City. At the same time, Bell was hearing from other places in the world, and one person who sent a letter to him was Queen Victoria, inviting him about 8 months after the first telephone was sold to come to Buckingham Palace and to do a demonstration there like he had done in Philadelphia. And so soon after that demonstration, there was a demand for telephones, particularly in the city, the financial section of London. And Bell decided, along with Gardner Hubbard, that they would start producing phones in England. So going back to the 5 drivers, really, that we looked at earlier, I think you'll see, as we go down them, that all those conditions were part of this case. First, there was a dynamic entrepreneur and somebody who was willing to break down any barrier, no matter what it was, in order to produce it. Second, he had put together a vibrant network of people, a cluster of people who were working on the telephone. And third, in the person of Charles Williams Jr., there was certainly somebody who was willing to buy the thing, even if Bell wasn't yet thinking of how was he going to produce it. And the funding, as we had seen earlier, was local. That was really part of the network, that vibrant network that Bell had. Lastly, we saw that, that the thing spread to London, and it had also spread to New York City even before the decision was made to start production in the UK. So 4 of these were local. This bump and connect idea that we talked about, you can see a little bit of this. And, you know, we didn't just find the 5 drivers once in this telephone thing that was, you know, the sort of vanilla innovation of it, but over and over again as we looked through the cases that we had studied in detail and some that we hadn't gone as much into detail on it, out of the 50 innovations. Well, this is in technology. A second one in technology, and one that it's hard not to think of because we're sitting in the very building where this happened, is in Waltham, 1813, 1814, the first full textile mill in the Western Hemisphere. Full meaning that it both had the carding side of it as well as the power loom side of it. You'll see in just a minute about that. Which had been done before, but it had been in the UK. If we can go to the next slide here, there were 3 financiers and 3 people really pushing the idea of starting a manufacturing company in 1813, 1814. This was during the War of 1812, and there was difficulty doing shipping at the time, and some of the merchants in Boston, including one that we'll talk about just for a second here, were looking to, could they make money by manufacturing things rather than just importing and exporting, being merchants. And Francis Cabot Lowell, who was the man in the middle of the picture, was the leader of this. And Lowell had gone over to Scotland, which is where the first full textile factories were, in about 6 years before, and had, through his own eyes, taken in what it was exactly that the Scots and the early British factories were doing to produce cotton goods and woolen goods. And Lowell brought in 2 partners. One was Patrick Tracy, and the other was Nathaniel Appleton. They were called the Boston Associates. The factory that they had set up here that you saw in the initial image was one that was, a lot of the work was done by a 4th person, a guy named, whose last name is Moody. What's his first name? Paul Moody, okay. So along the way, they really had started something which produced by 1814 material that was fairly well sewn and produced fairly quickly, and was sold in Boston and then very soon in New York City. Why don't we go on to the next stage here, which was looking at the 5 drivers here in terms of the production coming out of this Boston manufacturing company. The Boston Associates, and led by Francis Cabot Lowell, and then with extra help coming in terms of networking from Patrick Jackson and Appleton, and then the funding came from the original few people that we talked about, not Tracy Jackson, but Patrick Jackson. And 5 to 7 more investors joined it. The goods were sold first in New England and then in New York and in other states. And very soon there was national demand for the products. And so all 5 drivers were there and working together, again in this case that we had looked at early on in what we're studying. Why don't we go on to the next? Here is a picture of one of these looms that had been seen first by Lowell when he visited Scotland, and he had really memorized it, and then had been put together by Moody and Lowell and others here. So that is one major technological innovation that happened here on the Charles River. A little bit upstream, I guess it would be, in another part of Waltham, about 30 years later, Aaron Dennison took and developed something which was an important piece of machinery, really a watch, that was critical to many people in the mid-19th century. They were each individually produced almost everywhere, but Dennison felt that there could be a machine, an automatic screw machine, which could make the difference in terms of how much it cost, because it could be done with a machine rather than all fine craftsmen. And that machine helped to make the tiny screws and really allowed for the cheap soldiers' watches, which became so popular during the Civil War. Here's a picture, an image that shows both all the screws as well as all the flywheels and others that were needed to be put together in the Waltham watches, as they're called, after they started out as Boston watches and then be called Waltham watches. And so yet another piece of, another technological innovation happening in the same area that really changed the nation at that time. Other things also have happened in the Waltham locus of innovation, and are shown here at the Charles River Museum, where we're having this conversation. One thing that had become popular, a French innovation of the 1870s and 80s, was the bicycle. And it became very popular in the later 80s in Boston, as well as in the 1890s, which was really the golden age of the bicycles. And as with horse racing, bicycle racing became very popular very soon. And standard racing between the different cycles, as well as their bicycle riders, became great sport. And one of those people who was a great bicycle rider was a guy named Major Taylor, born in the Midwest, but had moved to Worcester, which is where he first did most of his bicycle riding. And he is somebody who, on a bicycle that was made here, the Orient bicycle made in Waltham, it had been changed a little bit. The Taylor, who was the rider, who was the first African American to win a world cycling championship, Taylor had said to the Orient bike management that he wanted to have the design changed a little bit. And I think we have a picture of that, head-on picture of that, maybe not. Okay, well, in any case, the bike that was ridden by Taylor, here it is. Here is the image. You can see the handlebar has been pushed down, and he has two smaller, equal-size wheels. It meant that he could tuck in his elbows and reduce some of the wind resistance. So a bunch of different innovations that have happened in this area. We've been talking a lot of technology. Alan, I was wondering whether you might talk with us a little bit about one in healthcare.
Absolutely. I thought you'd never ask. Yes. We're going to talk next about Dr. Sidney Farber. Farber's a pretty familiar name in medical circles here in Massachusetts. The subtitle of this slide is a refusal to accept no, which is a shorthand way of saying that Farber was one of those tough, no-nonsense entrepreneurs who was going to get things done that we've been talking about. Dr. Farber was initially associated with Children's Hospital back in the 1940s. And while he was there, he necessarily encountered quite a few young people suffering from childhood leukemia. At the time, it was essentially a death sentence. 85% of children afflicted with that died, and only a very small number survived. As we will see, his work over time produced an almost exact reversal of that to an 85% survival rate currently. At the time, though, the consensus was that it was something that could not be survived. The doctor's duty was just to make children as comfortable as possible. But Farber didn't want to believe it was that simple. He thought there might be an answer. In particular, he had observed or learned that folic acid was a critical nutrient for the growth of bone marrow, which is the seat of childhood leukemia. So he made an intuitive leap, as wise entrepreneurs often do. He wondered if reducing or eliminating the body's access to folic acid could impact leukemia. He thought if perhaps a drug could block folic acid, perhaps leukemia itself could be stopped. And he and his team did just that. They created this substance they named aminopterin, and they tested it on a first group of 16 patients, and remarkably, 10 achieved remission almost immediately. And this became, in effect, the birth of chemotherapy, which, of course, has saved millions of lives saved or prolonged millions of lives over the subsequent decades. Now, with those kinds of results, you would think that Dr. Farber would have been hailed immediately as a hero and given accolades, but in fact, a fair amount of the medical establishment was dubious. He had not come up through the ranks as a researcher or even a cancer doctor. He was actually a pathologist, as I think I mentioned. So he was getting the cold shoulder, if you will, from the medical community. And with that underwhelming response, that might have been the end for some people. But again, Dr. Farber was different. Fortuitously, there was a group associated with the show business people in the New England area called the Variety Club. And they were looking for charitable causes to support, and somehow through a network of people, they learned of Farber and vice versa. And they came and toured his lab and were very impressed with what they saw and decided to support his work. And that began the Children's Cancer Research Fund. And about a year later, another familiar name for Bostonians, the Jimmy Fund. This was named after a young man. Jimmy was the pseudonym. He was a leukemia sufferer, and he'd been on a national radio show to talk about the disease and Dr. Farber's work. And it attracted so much attention, they named this new fund after him, and it quickly became associated with sporting organizations, initially the Boston Braves, and then when they moved to Milwaukee, the Red Sox took over the sponsorship and helping to bring money to the fund. This in itself was a pretty significant innovation, because up until that time, sports was all about entertainment. There was no big social consciousness going on, and this was a real change of pace for the Red Sox, and that's why it's still with us today, the Jimmy Fund. So, you know, the end result of all that is today's Dana-Farber Research Institute. In addition to the local funding Dr. Farber attracted, he was also able to get funding from the Charles A. Dana Foundation, which enabled the creation of the much larger Dana-Farber Cancer Institute that we still have with us today, which is globally famous and a real asset for everyone, locally, nationally, and globally. And again, as I've been sort of mentioning throughout, right through here, you can see all the 5 drivers. The dynamic entrepreneur, Dr. Farber, his network of pediatricians and other people that could help him. Local demand, there obviously was in the unwell children and their parents and the doctors who wanted to help them. He found local funding, and then eventually national and global market demand and more global funding or national funding brought momentum and brought him to the status that he enjoys today. And, he's passed away, of course, but he's a legendary figure in Boston medicine. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Bob to talk about some of the other innovations we've touched on.
I know we're running closer on time than we had expected, so I'll try to do this quickly. So besides the 6 that we've looked at, from the 400 Boston-born innovations, so many different ones in different areas. First, anesthesia used in 1846 at Mass General Hospital allowed for a huge advance in medicine by allowing surgery to happen within the body cavity, which had never been able to happen before, that Mass General. The second one here is the sewing machine, which was invented by Elias Howe in Central Square in Cambridge. Along near South Station, Atlantic Avenue, King Gillette invented the safety razor, replacing what was called the cutthroat razor, which had been used in the entire world, done at the Brigham Hospital. The invention of the radar range, which was done just 2 blocks from where I'm sitting in Waltham at Raytheon Corporation there. And the first subway in the Western Hemisphere, the 3rd in the world. This is coming into Park Street Station. More recently, just 18 or 19 years ago, Massachusetts became the first state to allow for marriage equality. There wasn't another state that adopted it for 5 years, and then within 10 years, the Supreme Court had taken on what had been done in Boston. The moon landing wouldn't have been possible without the systems that were developed at Draper Labs, particularly by Margaret Hamilton there in terms of the miniaturization of computers, which couldn't have happened in 1969 otherwise. And then, of course, we have the chocolate chip cookie, which was invented by a graduate of the university I teach at, Framingham State University, she and Ruth Wakefield and her husband had a small restaurant in Whitman, Massachusetts, and the chocolate chip cookie went from non-existent in 1930 to being the most popular cookie in the United States. So there are hundreds more that come from this area. I would add Moderna, COVID-19 to that along the way. So I'm not sure how we're doing time-wise or whether we're really out of time. Do we have more time? Yeah. So our book, Boston Made, tells 50 stories of innovations and why they came from one city and one state. We don't really have time to get into social innovation that much, but Massachusetts was the first state to abolish slavery, and this came about by a constitution written by John Adams, but also, and in particular, an enslaved African-American woman in a small town in western Massachusetts, Sterling, Mass., who was a slave, heard the new Constitution read as it had to be read to the public in Massachusetts, and she decided to sue for her freedom, and the local jury in that village decided that Mambet was being held in slavery illegally and ordered her owners to pay damages. The owners appealed the case to the first state Supreme Court in the United States, which was then about 6 months old. And on a day later in 1781, just before the Battle of Yorktown was won by the Americans, In Massachusetts, slavery was abolished. And another comparison point to New York State, 46 years before the last slaves in New York State were freed in comparison to Massachusetts. Overall, one other thing that we found, maybe of lesser importance, but very important, is that the Massachusetts economy, including Boston, has had 4 major economic collapses in its 4 centuries. Each time, 1640s, the 1770s, when 85% of the population had died or left due to the British occupation, a third one in the collapse of the sailing ship economy in the 1850s, and a fourth when the shoe and the textile industry collapsed. Each time, new waves of innovation brought our economy out. Most other innovation-prone cities around the world have not had that experience, that the place comes back again and again. So, 3 major conclusions. Boston's the most innovative city or state in the nation for over 4 centuries, and probably one of the most innovative in the world. There's not data for us to compare with. Second, the innovations that have happened here, the reason for us to be able to come back in those recessions have to do with that secret sauce of the bump and connect, those 5 drivers that we looked at. And third, that we have been able to come back from economic collapses, which is really a different conclusion. In any case, this really is a story that we hope that you'll take a further look at, and we feel that it really puts a different light on what is it that makes Boston, Boston. Thank you so much, and we're very open to whatever questions our listeners have tonight.
Thank you very much, Bob and Alan. I think we do have time for a couple of questions. It strikes me, though, that the story of the Waltham Mills, the Boston manufacturing company, supports your story of the periodization of innovation in the Boston area, because the War of 1812, the collapse of commerce, and the Panic of 1819 resulted in the birth of domestic industry in the U.S. and in New England in particular, in this area in particular. So yes. I want to thank you in particular for talking about the Waltham stories, which made the program so special for our viewers this evening. Well,
it's special to be here at the site of where the industrialization of the United States really happened within these brick walls and along the Charles River here. So it was great to be hosted by the Charles River Museum, and we really appreciate it.
So what do you think is the role of place, how important does the role of place continue to be? I think you've shown the importance of these drivers of innovation with so much collaboration occurring on the internet, even through crowdsourcing and crowdfunding now. How does place retain its importance?
Well, we've had one particularly good example of that, as we've seen what's happened with the looking at the biotech industry in the world. Boston had 2 of the 5 initial companies as of the early 1990s, and now it has, of the 20 largest biotech companies in the world, 19 have major facilities in one part of Massachusetts. Place has a lot to do with it, and the biotech industry is part of that. The COVID-19 that came from Moderna is one, but also Pfizer has huge operations in Massachusetts, and the Johnson & Johnson study on the 3rd of the American anti-COVID ones was done at one of the main hospital complexes, the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital Complex. So, and this is all 15 or 20 years after you know, we've had the World Wide Web and that. So a lot of it is still place. Things are certainly changing, and you know, the world changes, and that doesn't mean that Boston is going to come up at the top of that. But it does mean that innovation is one that has a number of important factors that without which it doesn't happen that well. And otherwise, that we really need to have that both the culture of the place as well as the place itself make a big difference.
And it really speaks to the importance of human in-person connections and serendipitous conversations that can only occur when people are with one another.
Right, and serendipitous conversations happen when there are people in a culture where it's considered okay to challenge other people. And so in looking, and this is not something we've proven, but in looking over some of the history that we've done with the people who worked with the collaborative and with Alan and Earls and the writing of the book, you find that in the early history of Massachusetts, the conflicts around religiously, in terms of what is it that can make somebody part of the elect, led to a thing of people conflicting with each other and having to listen to each other, and sometimes driving those people out or hanging them, you know, along the way. But if that wasn't done, which is it wasn't done all the time, that the idea that you can take on somebody else's ideas, you don't have to be friends with them, that is very important to an innovative culture. So
I would just add one additional thought. You make the good point that in the age of the World Wide Web, so much collaboration can happen at a distance, but when people particularly are actually making a physical thing, whether it's a pharmaceutical or an innovative technology product, physical proximity to people with skills, the right capital equipment to do things, makes a big difference, and so much of that has been based in this area for so long. If you dissect the various waves of innovation that have occurred, often the ashes of one industry produce the efflorescence of the next, and many of the same components just appeared in a different form, the skilled people, the capital, and the workspaces even.
You speak of innovations as being culturally significant, culturally important. Does that always relate to mass production and entering popular culture, do you think? Is that the measure of impact?
I don't know, Alan.
Well, that's a good question. I guess that's something that was never totally nailed down in a completely airtight way.
Yeah.
It's good to have more areas of
Right.
inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me close up by asking you each, do you have a favorite innovation from the book or from your research?
Well, you know, I didn't think I did, but researching more about Dr. Goddard, who I'd growing up in the space as a space age kid with people going to the moon and so on, I knew about Goddard. I thought he was a pretty neat guy. But really getting to know all of his accomplishments, I was very impressed. He was far more seminal and deeper and wiser and more inventive than I ever would have thought. So he's not just a name on a NASA building. He really was a remarkable human being. So that's my favorite.
And I have one that's sort of personal. I grew up in the next town over here in Newton, and my father worked at a Raytheon, in fact, in the Waltham plant here, where the microwave oven was invented. And so it turned out they were looking for a home to take one of the first microwave ovens to actually work in a home and see how it was used and that sort of thing. And I don't know whether my father volunteered us or I think my mother opposed it, but in any case, we had one of the 4 microwave ovens in the house, and I was given, I was the youngest of 3 boys, and so I could fit between the microwave oven and our kitchen table. And so I was able to be part of the experiment for that great breakthrough, which now everybody has in their house. My wife always says that probably I got zapped a few too many times, and she tries to say that, and that's why you're irritable, Bob. If only the microwave hadn't done it, should have fit it. No, she never said it should have finished you off.
Do you remember what your parents cooked in it?
Baked potatoes was one of the stuff. They did experiments, though. One time they had some business people who my father was working with from another city, and they had a whole discussion as they were having a drink before dinner, what would happen. So they said, well, why don't you try putting scotch in a glass in the oven? And so we had our first explosion. It wasn't a rocket that was exploding, and it's lucky I wasn't in front of it at that time. So that's a little side of how I came close to innovation at an early age. I primarily liked American history, but the innovation stuff began to be in my blood one way or the other. So.
Well, I think anyone who knows me knows that my favorite innovation is doubtless what we locals may always call the Toll House cookie.
Right.
The chocolate chip cookie. Well, thank you so much for
Sure.
a fascinating conversation. Again,
Thanks for having us.
relating it so solidly to our area here. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so